we're ready to go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Good day. I would like to talk about the soil water balance, surface water processes, catchment management for this subject. Now let's talk about different terms we use. So uh, there are two terms used. One is called catchment and the other one is watershed. And you've probably heard of Hawkesbury Nepean catchment. And then you also heard river basin, drainage basin. So Murray-Darling Basin is one of the examples of river basin. And when we talk about watershed, what we mean is in the landscape, there is always some ridge. And when rain falls, water flows on the either side of the ridge. And that marks the watershed area. So this is the ridge, and water rain falling on this side flows through the landscape on this side through different channels, creeks, and through a river and into the ocean. And then comes the catchment. So catchment is the area which catches all the rainfall, and watershed is the ridge where water gets in the flows in the either direction as rain falls. And these two terms are widely used. Watershed more widely used in North America and some other countries. And watershed area is the one, but generally people say watershed management, watershed modeling, and so on. And catchment is widely used in Australia. And catchment area is the area of the land which captures water. And so these two terms, catchment area, watershed area, more or less mean the same thing, but different countries use different things. So in Australia, we use catchment area. And then we have what is called Murray-Darling Basin, and it has got different catchments. So basin is made up of different catchment areas, and it's one of the important catchments in Australia. So there are several interactions on play in catchment at any one time. And especially rainfall is an important element that influences several processes in catchment. So runoff, soil moisture storage, so water falls on the land, some runs off, some stored in the soil profile, some even goes deeper into the profile and recharges groundwater. And also rainfall, when water flows on the surface, it takes some soil particles and then it becomes sediments. So sedimentation is there all the time happening. And it is important, if you want to manage catchment, we need to understand what is happening in the catchment, how it is happening, why it is happening. All those things we need to understand. And monitoring of these processes is required. So we need to monitor, and monitoring depends on what is happening in the catchment depends on geology of the area. So what are the rock types and various things related to geology. Geomorphology, so how the landscape is formed as plains, as hills, and so on. That's important. Hydrology of the area, so how water moves and how water is stored and the interaction that happens. And there's another aspect, biogeochemistry. So how the biology of the area, geology of the area, and chemistry all affects water quality, water management. The soil science is also important because water interacts with soil and the ecology and microbiology. So there are so many things happening in the catchment. And if we want to manage the catchment holistically, we need to understand the all these aspects to manage sustainably, manage more effectively. So there are three things in the catchment: land, water, and air. And they are all interacting. So land is interacting with water, is runoff, and soil erosion, and so many things. Water and air also interact. So any pollution in the area, when rain falls, some of those polluted air can mix with water and can affect water quality. Air can also affect land. So dust particles from industrial area, for example, some dust or chemicals, they can drop onto the land, can affect soil quality, soil health. So all those things are happening all the time. And then there's another aspect. So there are animals in the catchment, there are plants, and there are microorganisms in the soil. And then we have people in the catchment, and they're all interacting. So animals are interacting with plants and microorganisms, and then people are impacting how we change landscape, how we use land, and we can influence animals. For example, if we clear land, then the habitats of animals are affected, and so on. So these interactions are happening. And then, so all these elements are impacting each other. And then, so this is the land, air, and water also interacting with all the things at the bottom, and they're interacting, impacting on each other. So interactions in the catchment are quite complex, but by monitoring various things in the catchment, we can understand what is happening, why it is happening, what can we do to manage catchment more effectively. So land and water, so they interact. Land affects water and water affects land. So the quality, the health of land and water are interconnected. So what affects land can affect water, and what affects water can affect land. So for example, if water quality is not good, contains salts, and if you use that water on the land through irrigation, land can become saline. Or if you apply pesticide, insecticide on the land, then when rain comes, the water can runoff can be polluted and can affect water quality. So what we need is the management. So if we want to sustain land and water, then we need management. So management requires monitoring. To manage well, we need to measure and monitor. So if we don't know what is happening, how much it is happening, then we can't really measure, we can't manage properly. So measuring and monitoring are important aspects. So now coming to catchment. So what are the interactions happening? So in any catchment, evaporation from water bodies is happening. Evapotranspiration is happening from the plants and soil or trees. And then through evaporation, clouds are formed, rain happens, and there is surface runoff. Then there is infiltration into soil, into the aquifer for groundwater recharge. And then this water can come back in the river as a base flow. And so water is circulating all the time. And so we need to have a good understanding of all these processes through monitoring and modeling. Now coming to different types of water and zones below this land surface. So on the land surface, this is the land surface, and we have plants and trees. And this is called root zone. So depending upon the type of plant, the root zone can be from say 30 centimeter or 0.3 meter to several meters below the surface. And then we have this unsaturated zone. So when there is rain or irrigation, water infiltrates through the soil, and then excess water goes below the root zone. And this is called unsaturated zone. So often this zone or this layer of the soil profile is not fully saturated. It means there is air, there is water. Then as we go deeper, uh, depending upon the geology of the area, the landscape, and so on, then there is an area where the depth, the thickness in the soil profile, which is fully saturated, means there is no air left. All the pore spaces are filled with water, and that's called saturated zone. And the unsaturated zone has got a special term called Veddos zone or soil water zone. So uh, there is some water, some air, and then there is a capillary zone. So above the saturated zone, there is always rise in water because of the capillary action. So when soil is below saturation, there is attraction between soil and water particles, and the water is lifted off because of the capillary action. And this height of the thickness of the capillary zone depends on the soil type. So if it is clay soil, the thickness is higher, and if it is sandy soil, thickness is lower. So in sandy soil, it could be few centimeters, whereas in capillary, in the clay soils, it can be up to a meter. So, uh, the, the capillary rise depends on how fine the pore spaces are. So if pore spaces are smaller, the rise is higher. If pore spaces are bigger, then the capillary rise is smaller. So that's why in sandy soil, the thickness of capillary zone is smaller or thinner compared to in the clay soil. And there's always a confining bed depending upon where we are in the landscape. And this root zone, the water content varies, so it can change because of the rainfall or water we apply through irrigation, especially in agricultural fields. And the upper layer of this saturated zone is called water table. And this whole area where the underground water is stored is called aquifer. And this has got a special term called groundwater. So groundwater is the water below the surface of the soil or land, and this water um, is stored as a saturated water in the soil profile, and it can move in response to hydraulic head. So it's a groundwater, whereas this water in unsaturated zone doesn't move, uh, and it is stored in the soil here and can be made available to plants. So let's understand the three terms: soil, land, and landscape. So soil basically is a mixture of minerals, organic matter, and other things that can support plant life. So soil has got sand, silt, and clay. These are the main particles. And then there is always some organic matter, and that makes up the soil. And the proportion of these three main elements, sand, silt, and clay, uh, determines the texture of soil. So if soil contains, say, more than 70% clay, then it's called clay soil. And if sand soil contains equal proportion of these particles, sand, silt, and clay, then it's called loam soil. And sandy soil has got high proportion of sand particles and can be up to 80-90% of the sand particles. And so these particles are defined based on the size, the diameter of these particles. So clay has got the smallest particles, and then silt is in between, and then there's a sand. And land is surface of the earth that is not permanently covered by water. So land contains soil, and so land is the surface on the earth. And then there is another term called landscape. So it's a visible feature of an area of land, and it's landform. So whatever we can see with our eye is the landscape. So landscape has got land, plants, river, land, buildings, etc., visible to the eye. So we really need to understand these different terms to understand the whole idea of the catchment. So monitoring in the catchment. So soil water monitoring, how soil moisture is changing, and water monitoring. So water monitoring is the amount of water, the quality of water. And then in water monitoring, we can monitor surface water, groundwater. So surface water is water we see in reservoir, lakes, in creeks, in river, in oceans. And groundwater is the water below the surface of this land, and water in the well or water coming out of springs, that's groundwater. And so both surface water and groundwater are important aspects of water monitoring, and they are connected. So groundwater feeds to surface water recharges groundwater. So we can't really separate groundwater from surface water. And also what happens to surface water can affect quality of groundwater. So if the surface water is polluted or gets polluted, then it can impact on the quality of groundwater. So why do we do soil water and water monitoring? So first thing is we want to benchmark initial condition, keep an eye on what is happening. So if we want to manage these resources, we really need to have a benchmark. So monitoring water quality for river health, for example, is can help us to see if the river health is changing and how it is changing and so on. Sometimes it's a requirement, compliance requirement from regulatory agency like EPA for discharge of treated wastewater, mine water in a local stream. So it can be a compliance requirement, and so we need to monitor. It's about also decision making about some operations. So monitor soil moisture for deciding on the next time for irrigation. So if we can monitor, then we know how much is the water available, and then schedule next irrigation so that we don't impact on the growth of the plant and the crop yield. Monitoring can also help in design of new intervention or activities. So, for example, design of septic system, suitable site for waste disposal, design of irrigation method, all this requires some sort of monitoring. So if we have the data, then it helps to make informed design. Now coming to soil water monitoring. So in the soil, we have plants and we have roots, and they take water from the soil, water stored in soil pores, and then they transport eventually to leaves. And over here, there is transpiration happening. Means plant leaves have got stomata, and because of the difference in the osmotic pressure, which is the pressure in the soil and the pressure created here. So the water evaporates, get transported, and then from here it gets transpired. And if sufficient supply is there all the time, then water keeps moving in is to meet the atmospheric demand from the leaves. And when there is insufficient water, then there is a natural mechanism in plant leaves. So the stomata, where the water gets get out of the plant leaves, they get closed or they narrow down to control the water consumption and still maintain the life. But if water keep if the scarcity of water in the soil profile continues, and that affect, then it will start affecting the plant physiology, and wilting of the plant starts. And then if that continues, then plant dies. So by monitoring how much water in the soil profile, we can maintain the growth of the plant to an optimal level. Now, soil water monitoring, soil environment monitoring is important for agriculture, land treatment of waste, remediation of contaminated sites, and other human activities. So we are all the time doing something with the soil and land, and to really sustain our activity, we need to monitor. So there are soil physical properties, chemical properties, biological properties we need to monitor depending upon what is important. So the examples of the parameters we can monitor is bulk density, soil moisture, pH, EC, microbial population. So for example, bulk density tells us how compact the soil is. So for example, if we want to maintain soil health, and there is traffic because of the animals in the field, cattle in the field, or some machinery, that can change the structure of the soil. And by measuring bulk density, we can identify whether things are changing and to what extent, and whether we need to do any intervention. Soil moisture can help us to schedule irrigation, for example, can help us to develop the water balance of the catchment. So we know how water is moving and how water is stored in the catchment, in the soil profile, in the groundwater system, in the lakes and rivers, and so on. So soil moisture is required, especially if we want to do hydrologic modeling. pH and EC are important. They tell about the chemistry of the soil, and then also affect the water quality as well. So pH and EC are important measurements, and they are routinely done and easy to do. And similarly, the microbial population. So microbes in the soil tells about the health of the soil. So if the microbial population is low, soil is uh, probably dead, or sometimes can't sustain life, especially plant life. So microbial health also is equally important. Not only physical health, but microbial health, chemical health. And soil properties can change with time due to the various interventions. So if you apply fertilizer in on the land for growing crops, it can change the chemistry of the soil. Compaction due to heavy machinery. So all these things can affect soil health, and so soil environmental monitoring is critical to manage the catchment. So carrying out the sampling. So regardless of the purpose of sampling, sample needs to be representative of the area. So we want to make sure that whatever we sample, that represents the whole area. And so we need to some sort of sample collection. We need to be organized if you're doing sampling. So sample collection, the protocol for sample collection, handling. So once you collect the sample, how you bring back to the lab, and it's important to label properly. So we report uh, accurately, correctly, and also consistency. So collect sample in a uniform manner, so there is no sort of systematic error. So whatever way you collect the sample, you do repeat the same thing, the procedure for every sample. And that way we minimize any systematic error or some other random errors. And to really do good sampling, simplify the procedure and ensure the consistency. And sampling location. So how do we sample? So there could be random walk sampling. So randomly select starting location in the field and other subsequent sampling location based on randomly selected directions and the movement. So for example, if this is a field and we want to sample the soil of the area or plants in the area, so we divide uh, in some sort of grid and randomly walk across the field and take the sample. So that's also a good way to sample, and that way we capture the whole of the area in terms of whatever we are sampling. Grid sampling. So this is a little bit more systematic. So we are sampling at each grid. So divide the land into or area into a grid, and then each point you take the sample. And transect sampling. So we have the walking transect in the area, and you take samples along each transect, and that's also a valid way to sample. Now coming to infiltration. So infiltration is one of the important processes in catchment, soil water infiltration, and it is the process of water crossing the soil surface to enter the root zone. So when there is a rain or water ponding on the surface, infiltration is the entry of water into the soil. And then water moves on the sideways in the soil profile or and vertically down. And it is important to know how much water infiltrates during rain or irrigation so that we know uh, how much water is stored in the soil and where it goes. And ultimately, we need to know how long to apply water so that we can change the soil moisture content to the desired amount. So especially for irrigating fields, we want to know how long to apply because the rate of infiltration will depend on the soil uh, structure, soil texture, And if you know the infiltration rate and how they vary over time, then we can decide on how long to water particular field. What causes infiltration into the soil? So there are two basic uh, mechanisms or forces that act on water when you pond water on the land surface. So one is the gravity. So gravity is the force of gravity pulls water into and through the soil pores. So there's always gravitational force acting on water when it's ponded on the surface, and that pulls water vertically through the soil. So the infiltration starts. And then there is a capillarity. So capillarity is the attraction of water due to metric potential that pulls water into the pores. So what that means is soil has got these pores, and these pores you can think of the pores are connected throughout the soil profile, and they can be viewed as a capillary tube. So the soil is composed of numerous capillary tubes, and the size of the capillary tube depends on the texture and structure of the soil. So when the water is there, because of this capillary action, the water is pulled. So when water enters through the gravity, and then the capillary forces act on water, and then it pulls and distributes water within the soil profile horizontally and vertically. And when soil is dry, the force of capillary is the maximum. And then when capillary gets filled up, the capillary force decreases. And then when capillary is full of water, that is, soil is fully saturated, then the force of capillary becomes negligible. And the only force acting on water is the gravity. So when soil is fully saturated, the water moves downwards. When soil is unsaturated, water moves downwards, that is the gravitational force, as well as sideways into the soil. So that is the difference between the gravity and capillarity. So gravity makes water to move vertically down. Capillarity moves uh, makes water to move on sideways and downwards uh, in the soil profile. So effect of the wetted zone on short time after adding water on the surface. So depending upon the soil type, if you pond water uh, in some soil, it will infiltrate like this and form this sort of shape, wetted zone. And in some soils, it will be elongated pattern. So this is the case for more loam type soil. And this is the case for sandy soil. So sandy soil, there's more water moving through the gravity downwards, whereas in the loam or clay type soil, water is moving sideways as well. So that helps us to how we apply water and make water available to plants. So we don't want to apply water more than what is stored in the root zone. So if we have a sandy soil, we need to be conscious that significant amount of water can move below the root zone through this sort of pattern, and that can be wastage of water. So by understanding how the soil, how the water moves in the soil, can help us to reduce water wastage. Now, infiltration. So this is how infiltration rate varies over time in any soil. So when we pond water, means time is zero, infiltration rate is high. So infiltration rate means how many millimeters of water is going into the soil per minute or per second or per hour. So when we pond, say for example, 100 millimeter of water on the soil surface, and if it takes say 60 minutes for that 100 millimeter water to infiltrate, the infiltration rate is 100 millimeter per hour. So this is how infiltration rate varies. And so initially it's very high. Then as time passes, it reduces because the capillary action is less effective, and mainly it is gravity. And then after a long time, it becomes steady state. So infiltration is dominated by or mainly by gravitational force. And so that's the steady state infiltration rate. So infiltration rate varies with the moisture content of the soil. So dry soil is high infiltration rate, and as it gets wet and saturated, it becomes it gets a steady state, constant rate. And this is called basic infiltration rate or steady state infiltration rate. And this is if we plot the cumulative depth of infiltration and plot the time here, then it becomes, so it keeps increasing. And initially the increase is high because soil is dry. And as time passes, the rate of increase is constant because the infiltration rate becomes constant. So initially high infiltration amount, then it becomes steady rise. Now, effect of soil type. So silt loam has got low infiltration, clay has got low infiltration rate, but sandy soil has got high infiltration rates and cumulative infiltrate. So the amount of water infiltrated through soil, if it is sandy, will be higher compared to sandy loam, slate loam, or clay soil for same amount of time. And the how much water to apply. So if we want to apply certain amount of water, the depth, so we need to understand what soil type we have, and then we adjust the time we need to apply so we don't over irrigate and so on. How do we measure infiltration rate and infiltration amount? So the simple way is we pond water, and the device often used is called double ring infiltrometer. So we have these two cylinders. So we pond water in both cylinders and measure the water uh, level 4 in the middle, the inner ring, and that gives us the how much water is getting infiltrated over time. And from that measurements, time and the depth, drop in depth, we can uh, calculate infiltration rate and also the cumulative infiltration depth. And why we do have double rings or double cylinders here? So because we want to measure the vertical infiltration, means water going into the soil, not the sideways. So by having second ring or outer ring here, so that makes the water infiltrating into the middle ring going straight down. And that way we have the normal sort of unbiased infiltration. Otherwise, we have, if we use only single ring or single cylinder, then water is moving sideways as well as vertically down. And in the actual field situation, if you pond, say, for example, water over 1 hectare, for example, the water is actually moving downwards, not sideways, mostly vertically down. So that's what we want to simulate through this measurement. And that's why we have double rings or 2 cylinders, and we measure water level in the middle one. So what we do, we try to maintain the water level constant in both sides, and then we keep adding water as the water moves down. So try to maintain more or less similar or same height, this depth, and that way we can measure the infiltration rate. So we know how much water we are adding into this inner ring, and then the time elapsed, and that if we keep measuring for say up to 1 hour, we get every 5 minutes, few minutes, and so on. Then we get the amount of water infiltrated, and then time it took, and we can convert the amount into depth of water infiltrated, and then into the infiltration rate and cumulative infiltration depth. And that sort of measurement gives us the infiltration characteristics of soil, and that's very important for anything we want to do with the water balance studies or designing irrigation system or septic system or irrigation scheduling and so on. Soil water. So as I mentioned before, soil consists of sand, silt, and clay. And whether soil is a sand or silt or clay depends on the size of the particles. So relative size of the particles, so if clay is this size, which is less than 2 microns or 0.002 millimeter, then silt is 0.002 to 0.005. So this small dot and the bigger dot, that's the difference in the soil particles. And sand is between 0.005 to 2 millimeter diameter. So you can see the relative size of sand, silt, and clay. And how much clay is there in percentage, sand and silt? Then if we know this percentage, then we can use this triangle, soil texture triangle, to determine what is the texture of the soil. So for example, if we have 50% clay content and 30% sand and rest is the silt, then that is called clay soil. So this anything with all these amounts of sand, silt, and clay is this clay soil. Similarly, this is the area the texture is sand and loam and so on. So if we can measure sand, silt, and clay in a particular soil, then we can find the texture of the soil. And any soil sample you take or any soil you take, so these are the soil particles, and in between the particles is the pore space, and some of the pores are filled with water, so that's the soil water, and then you have the air. And when you're growing plants, trees, they need water and they need air as well for the roots to grow and be healthy. So both air and water in soil are important, not fully saturated soil, otherwise it's a waterlogged soil and plants will die. So we need air, water, and the soil particles. So soil particles helps absorb nutrients and then they release into water, then taken off. Water helps to transport those nutrients to plant different parts of the plants through the leaves, and leaves use those nutrients plus sunlight to um, grow or to really make the food for the plant. Now, water in the soil. So when soil is saturated, there is no air pocket left, so no air left. So all the pore spaces are filled with water. And this water is, some of the water is temporary storage. So the bigger pores can get emptied by the force of gravity. And so the water comes out. So water flows uh, into the soil profile to the deeper layer. And then some water after the, so you can see like this. So when you pond water on this land surface or through rain, water moves into the soil gets saturated, and the force of gravity is still acting on the water in the soil profile. And it keeps pulling water down. And then there will be a time come when gravity can't pull any more water. Means the water stored or sort of bound within the soil profile and the gravitational force are in balance. So whatever water is left, gravity can't pull any more water. The force of capillary and the force of gravity is in balance. So that's the water content here. And it's called filled capacity water content. Means the temporary water has gone. Another example I can give you is, say, if you take a sponge and put in a bucket of water and you take out that sponge, and the water will start dripping because of the force of gravity. The pores in the sponge are bigger pores will lose water because of the force. But if we squeeze that sponge, uh, some extra water will come. If we still squeeze, some more water will come, but there will be time come, no more water will come. So same thing happens in soil. Soil is like a sponge. So there will be a temporary water which will move because of the gravity. There will be a water, another level of water, which you can squeeze, means the plants can take water through their roots. So that's available water. But if you, there might be a water which might be uh, too tightly held in soil profile, which is unavailable. So that becomes unavailable waters. And that water is hardly available. And we don't want to get to that point. So just to give an idea, there are different level of storage of water and different level of forces that act on water. So temporary water is got that moves with the action of gravity. Then there is available water, which can be pulled or taken up by plants and can move. But then there is another level of water, which is unavailable water, and that is not available. And the soil if we put wet soil in, say, outside, make it air dry, and so there will still be some water, but mostly it is feels dry. So that's the unavailable water. And so coming to the landscape catchment, so you have plants and trees. So there will be some water going into the soil, into the plant, into the atmosphere, and then there will be some water moving because of the gravity, free flow, freely draining water. And the water will keep moving through the plant leaves. And then that's the field capacity water. And then there will be a limit how far you can go. And then plant starts wilting, means plant needs some water because they need to meet the transpiration requirement. And if these requirements are not met for so for a continuous time, so plant will start wilting and show, okay, I'm getting thirsty. But then If you plant again and water again, then they get back to their normal state. But if that continues, the plant dies. So that's the wilting point. So soil water tension. Initially, wet soil, there's less tension, means water can be moved, can be extracted. But when soil becomes dry, you require more sort of pressure or more force to get that water out from soil. And we can express this through this volumetric water content and the soil water tension through this graph. So at low tension, water release, there's more water release. But as the tension increases, we can't extract water. So understanding this sort of curve helps us how much water is available for plants and trees. And capillary forces. So just to explain what makes water stick in the soil. So if we take a container and put a capillary tube, the water will rise from this level to a certain height against the normal atmospheric pressure. And that height is called capillary rise. And this water rises because surface tension and the cohesive forces with the water molecules in the tube. So if we have smaller tube, the water will rise even higher. And if we have wider tube, bigger diameter tube, the height will be lower. So lower height means like sandy soil, and then higher rise means a clay soil, means the capillary size is finer. So just to illustrate, so bigger diameter tube, capillary tube, smaller diameter, the same atmospheric pressure, but the rise is lower and rise is higher here. And so if particle these pores are larger, then there is less capillary, little capillary action or capillary force. Water can easily move through the plant roots into the atmosphere through the transpiration process. But when the capillary tube is smaller, diameter is radius is smaller, the capillary force is higher and it requires more suction or more pressure to pull that water, force to pull that water. And this graph shows volumetric water content and soil water tension. So this is the free gravitational water, means water stored in the soil at saturation moves in response to gravitational force. And that happens within, say, 24 hours of saturating the soil. Then comes the available water. So between the 0.34 and 0.16 of the suction. Sorry, this is between the more than 10 or more than 10 centibars, and then more than 1,000 centibars of the pressure. So this is the available water, and beyond that is unavailable water. And just to show this same graph for different soil types. So this is for fine sandy soil, fine sands and silty loam. So this saturation, fill capacity, wilting point varies with the soil water tension. And how do we measure soil water? Must know the water status to be able to manage it well. Can measure potential water content. Need to relate water content and potential. So measuring is very important. Sorry about that. So measure soil water potential. We can use what is called tensiometer. Then we can also measure water through gypsum block. And then there are other things available like Watermark is one of the brands of doing this. We can also measure what is called time domain refractometry. So this is a capacitance type instrument, and by using this, we can measure how much is the soil moisture indirectly. And then the other instrument that is used is called neutron probe. So it's there is a radioactive source, and so it contains the it emits the nutrients, and these nutrients collide with the hydrogen uh, atoms, and that indirectly gives you how much is the moisture content. And this is widely used in agriculture for monitoring soil moisture for irrigation management. So in conclusion, monitoring of soil and water is important for maintaining environmental health, catchment health. Soil and soil water monitoring is about physical, chemical, and biological health of soil. Soil and water interact, and any problem with one can affect the other one. And it can eventually affect the whole ecosystem and sustainability. And soil health is very important for plant growth. It is of immense interest for farmers, gardeners, and others. And also, it overall affects the catchment health. Thank you.
Well done.